Hi, my name is Carol Schall, and I'm here to present a webcast on the intersectionality of people with disabilities and other marginalized identities. As I begin to talk about this webcast, I want you to know that I usually talk a lot about the behavioral challenges that people with disabilities face at work. However, I have found through my work that a lot of times those behavioral difficulties are actually cultural misunderstandings. And so I feel like it's important to address this topic for a number of reasons. So the purpose of this webcast is to increase your awareness of the impact of intersectional identities on people with disabilities. We will describe and define all of those terms momentarily. In addition, we want to end by increasing your skills to support individuals with disabilities who are from diverse backgrounds and who may experience prejudice or other forms of marginalization. So why is this important? Well, it's important for you to understand the impact of these intersectional identities as they impact individuals with disabilities. This should increase your ability to work with others from a place of empathy and to understand that sometimes your misunderstanding of a behavior might be caused by cultural differences. We ultimately want to advocate for the abilities of the people that we serve. We all are working hard to make sure that people with disabilities are able to work to their fullest potential and earn a fair wage for their work. And the only way to do that is for us to be continually aware of and combat the challenges associated with all of the prejudices and biases that people with disabilities might be subject to. Finally, when we increase our own cultural responsiveness, we become more effective in interacting with all people with whom we might come into contact with. These are all good reasons for us to talk about this topic today. So let's begin by defining cultural responsiveness. Cultural responsiveness is the ability to relate respectfully with people of your own culture as well as those from other cultures. In fact, you right now are engaging in some behaviors that were determined by your cultural experiences that you might not be aware of. And so by learning about cultural responsivity and other cultures, you become aware of your own cultural biases and perspectives. We also want to look at the impact of these intersectional identities on people with disabilities. First, let's define this term, intersectional. Intersectionality refers to the complex and cumulative ways in which multiple forms of discrimination might impact an individual. So Kimberly Crenshaw, who was an attorney, originally coined this term intersectionality. Having been an attorney, she worked often with people who encountered accidents. And one of the things that she noticed is that an accident on a road where you maybe hit someone in front of you is usually far less severe than an accident at an intersection. That's because on a road where you're traveling in the same direction as the other cars around you, any accident is likely to be singly impactful. In other words, if you bump into the car in front of you, you've damaged your bumper and your front bumper and their rear bumper. You might get hit from behind, but the damage generally is from the same direction. However, when you're in an intersection and you get hit, you're much more likely to be hit in more than one direction. You might be hit from the side, you might be hit from the front, from behind, from the other side. She used this to describe the cumulative and overlapping effects of different levels of prejudice or bias that people might encounter. So a person with a disability who also happens to be racially marginalized is going to have cumulative effects. It's not that they have one bucket where they are marginalized or discriminated against because of being of a racial diverse culture, and another bucket where they're discriminated against, and that those things cancel each other out and it's fairly equal. that 1 plus 1 equals 2. No, in this case, 1 plus 1, one marginalized identity according to race, one marginalized identity according to disability could equal 4. 4 different ways in which a person might be discriminated against. And that's the way we overlap these intersectional identities in a way that could be harmful to individuals with disabilities. When we understand this impact, we also have to understand a little bit about the history of intersectionality and disability. From the very beginning of classification of ability in the early 1900s, disability, race, and ethnicity have been intertwined to the detriment of marginalized peoples. So these attitudes gained popularity by insinuating incorrectly that race, ethnicity, ability, and even crime were genetically and irrevocably linked. In other words, the fact that you were born of a certain race or culture would determine your ability level and the likelihood that you would engage in crime. Of course, we know that this is wrong, but this is part of the way that bias and prejudice was formed and built into our system. This led to pervasive and insidious ableism, specifically that individuals with disabilities are less than others without disabilities. This is the very bias that we as support providers confront on a daily basis. As we work with individuals who seek employment, we know that we're bumping up against attitudes that suggest that just because a person uses a wheelchair or has a cognitive impairment, that they can't do a job, excuse me, to the satisfaction of their employer. If we want to change those attitudes and those outcomes for people with disabilities, then we have to increase our awareness of these intersections, and especially the intersections of race, ethnicity, culture, and disability. It's those interactions that act as barriers for people. And in short, we can do this by becoming culturally responsive. Let's first define ableism so we have a clearer idea of what we mean here. Plain and simple, ableism is discrimination and social prejudice. It's the assumption that people who do not have disabilities are superior to people who have disabilities. We know this is not true, but this attitude is so pervasive that most people don't even know the term ableism as one of the terrible isms we have to confront. We also see this being lived out by people assuming that disabilities should be fixed or cured, or assuming that people with disabilities are somehow very, very brave to live in a world with a disability. These harmful stereotypes and misconceptions result in a world where people with disabilities have difficulty finding jobs, getting about in their communities, accessing transportation, becoming members of clubs. These are harmful, and then they harm the people that we support. In order to be culturally responsive, we also have to understand the impacts of culture in the way we interact in the world. And so in order to do this, we're going to review the culture tree. The culture tree was developed by Zaretta Hammond, who wrote about this in her book, Culture and the Brain, where she talked about culture in 3 different levels. The first level is the surface level, or the leaves of the tree. These are observable patterns that you can see. You might see someone with a different hair texture, type, or style, and automatically know that they are of a different culture. You might visit someone and notice that they're cooking food from a different culture that is unlike your own. Or you might hear someone talk or use language or tell stories or play games that look different than the ones that you played or interacted with in your culture. These observable patterns usually have low emotional impact on trust. We can readily see those differences, appreciate them, and move on. We can even comment on them and know that we're not particularly at risk of violating the trust of the people with whom we're acting. The trunk of this tree then is referred to as the shallow culture. It's just above the ground, but you might miss it for all of the leaves surrounding it. Shallow culture are unspoken rules. These have higher emotional impact, and these relate to theories that people hold that might be impacted by their culture. For example, how much eye contact does an individual make with you? This might be determined by culture. What is the nature of relationships between people? For example, some cultures view the relationships between elders and younger people as sacred, and they have very specific rules about how those relationships should be managed. There might be different ways of handling emotions. The degree to which you're allowed to be angry or cry in public might be governed by your cultural experiences. What is being honest? How should we raise children? How do we non-verbally communicate? These are all shallow culture, nevertheless unspoken rules that impact us. They usually carry high emotional impact. If we suggest that someone of a different culture is raising their child incorrectly because of a culturally held belief, then we might really be insulting someone, and we might be violating the trust of that person has in us. The deepest level of culture then is represented by the roots of this tree. These are usually concepts that you may not even be aware of yourself. Concepts like, what is kinship? Who is a family member? Who am I in relationship to the other people within my culture? What is my relationship with animals and with nature? What do I think is fair? How do I make decisions? Do I prefer competition or cooperation? Where do I feel most comfortable? These are things that you're probably not aware of in your own culture. And yet, if someone suggests that you are wrong in the way that you're living your life by taking these deeply held norms and unconscious beliefs into account, then you would have an intense emotional reaction. If someone told you you shouldn't go to college, instead you should stay home, and it's against your cultural values and norms to stay home, your culture tells you that you should go off and become independent, then you would be extremely offended by someone suggesting otherwise. If you don't understand this deep cultural worldview about your clients, you are likely to be tremendously mistrusted. This gets to this notion of individualism versus collectivism. I find that this particular dimension can really help you understand cultural misunderstandings that you might view as behavioral challenges. And so most of us, particularly most of us in the United States, have been raised with individualism as our main value. We think that self-reliance is much more important than interdependence. We value competition. We seek emotional difference from our families, our cultures, our elders, or our tribes. And in fact, there are many in-groups that we can belong to. We really pay attention to freedom, and we use freedom as a way for us to determine how satisfied we are. We are most satisfied when we feel free from others. There are other cultures within our midst where the exact opposite is valued more highly. Specifically, we call these collectivist cultures, cultures where it's not self-reliance, but interdependence that's important, where an individual is valued if they subordinate their personal goals to the group goals. There is a high value for in-group integrity and loyalty. And the stability of the in-group is most important. In these cultures, you wouldn't dream of missing a family event in order to accomplish a personal accomplishment. In fact, satisfaction is determined in this culture by upholding your in group, whether that's your family, your elders, your tribe, or your culture. Understanding this as different cultural experiences can explain the behavior that you might see as different in someone else. So, understanding the impact of culture increases your ability to understand your clients and meet their needs. So, let's talk next about skills that you might need to look at to support individuals with disabilities who are from diverse backgrounds. We're going to call these tools for cultural responsivity. First, I want you to consider how you could learn about someone with a disability's cultural view. Well, first, you have to give your full attention to what that person is saying. That means that you're not listening to figure out what you're going to say to be right. Instead, you're listening to understand. You have to remember that very often, the way people with disabilities, in fact, the way all of us communicate, is using behavior. So we have to really pay attention to what really upsets someone and what keeps someone on track. We want you to understand the feelings behind the words and the behaviors and be sensitive to the emotions that are being expressed. You, in essence, as a support provider, you want to notice how important an issue is to an individual with a disability by the emotional content expressed when they are talking about an event or expressing a behavior. Suspend your own judgment and listen with compassion and empathy. If you see someone who reacted differently than you might react to a situation, you should really work to stop judging. Instead, seek to learn about that individual's culture. Honor the speaker's cultural way of communicating. Don't adopt it, don't make fun of it, don't copy it, but instead honor it and translate it into a way that you can understand. And then finally, validate the validate the individual's feelings and seek a solution that honors their culture while also addressing their employer's needs. It is by practicing these skills that you can apply cultural responsiveness and learn more deeply about the cultural needs of your clients. The next set of skills is going to show you, once you understand those cultural differences, how should you respond when you see an interaction that seems to, at its base, to be cultural. First, listen with grace. That means that you listen to understand. You want to reduce the social emotional stress experienced by the individual that might be present from bias or prejudice. I'll show you in a minute how we do this. You want to balance both care and push. And by that I mean you care deeply about the individual and their culture, but you also want to push them to a new place where they can both honor their culture and meet the needs of their employer. You want to help cultivate a sense of self-efficacy, that the individuals themselves can take responsibility for their own career path. And then finally, you want to support your client in taking ownership of their own employment. Let's review a scenario so I can show you how you would go about these 5 essential tools. In this scenario, your client is named Carlos. Carlos is an individual who's employed at a local hospital. He's been there for 12 weeks and he's very successful at the job. He works in materials management, and in that job, he delivers supplies to the hospital's surgical and medical floors. He works 24 hours a week, and his supervisor is very happy with his work. His employer has called, though, 12 weeks into his employment, to tell you that Carlos didn't show up for work one day last week. She said that Carlos told her that he was home for his abuela's birthday party. He didn't call in sick. He didn't ask for time off. He didn't call in and say, I'm going to be late. I've got this birthday party to go to. He just skipped work. The supervisor is asking for your help as an employment support provider to address this attendance issue with Carlos. Now, knowing that Carlos might be coming from a collectivist culture, an experience that says his family is important above all other parts of his life, how would you build trust and rapport with Carlos? How would you listen to Carlos with care while also providing push for him to be more successful at work? And then finally, how would you increase Carlos's sense of self-efficacy? Well, the next slide shows you how you could do that. First, you want to listen with grace. Talk to Carlos about the party. Ask about his abuela and acknowledge how important Carlos's family is to him. Actually say to him, I know your family is the most important thing in the world to you. Let Carlos know that he was right to want to be with his abuela and that his supervisor was depending on him as well, that both of those are true and they're not mutually exclusive. You're not telling him, ignore abuela. You're also not telling him, skip out on work, that you're going to find a solution to honor both his family commitment and his commitment to work. Remind Carlos that his employer needs him at work, but that if he has an important family event, he can request time off. Review the process for Carlos requesting time off. This next section tells you to give Carlos wise feedback. Wise feedback is to acknowledge that Carlos made a mistake, to take time off without asking for the day off, but that mistakes are okay. Put this correction in its proper place. Everybody makes mistakes, even young people who are employed early on in their careers. Let them know that mistakes are okay and that it's actually possible for him to meet his employer's expectations and make his abuela happy. But the best way to do that is for him to ask for time off. The final step in this is for him to take responsibility for his employment. And that means that he should apologize to his employer for forgetting to ask for time off. That the next time he will remember to put in for time off before he stays home for an important family event. This is how you build cultural responsivity into your interactions with someone like Carlos, who you've identified as someone who really does value family, even above his own employment. In closing, I hope you now understand how increasing cultural responsiveness increases your awareness about how others view the world, and that when you use these skills with your clients, you're going to increase the success of your own practice and their success as well. I wish you luck as you incorporate these practices into your work as a job coach, employment specialist, or vocational rehabilitation provider.